We're well positioned. We have a strong defence industry in the UK. How do we exploit that for national and NATO benefit?
One of the things that the UK has that most other countries don't have is a nuclear deterrent. That definitely gives the UK this sort of superpower or great power status.
We can't just have announceables as headlines. We need proper delivery against the strategic ambition.
Hello and welcome back to Defence Talks, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. I'm Viktorija Summerlin, co-founder at the Council on Geostrategy, and I'm here today as always with my co-host Paul Mason.
Great to be here, Victoria. We're speaking off the back of the NATO Ankara Summit.
We indeed are, and all eyes have been on Turkey earlier this week, Paul.
Correct, and we've now shifted in Ankara. It's quite clear that the alliance has shifted from well and truly from this sort of abstract concepts phase of what it's going to do about the threat towards real money on the table and real, we hope, real joint procurement and coordinated procurement. We've got 12 nations convened by the UK behind a £37 billion deep precision strike initiative and a £30 billion alliance on counter-drone capability.
In addition to this, a couple of days ago as well in the UK, in Portsmouth, we hosted the NATO Industrial Advisory Group event, and today we are absolutely delighted to have an opportunity to discuss both events and the outcomes and what it means for the UK and also for the Alliance with our three wonderful guests. So we are joined by Emma Baker from ADS, Sir Stuart, Atha, and also Charles Clover.
Yes, and Charles, you are the Defence and Security Correspondent at the FT. Sir Stuart Atha is Director at BAE Systems and is head of the UK NIAG Delegation. Emma Baker, was Group Facilitator for the NIAG Delegation. Welcome all. There's a lot to talk about. We'll focus on NIAG in a bit, but let's get your initial reactions to the summit itself.
So perhaps, Sir Stuart, let's start with you.
Yes, it was very interesting. Obviously, lots of dynamics, and the way one of our diplomats put it, it's a little bit like a penalty shootout. There were football metaphors throughout the summit, unsurprisingly. And what he said, it's a little bit like a penalty shootout. You can do all the preparation that you can, but you just never know how it's going to go at the time, what's going to happen. So the ability to show progress there, focus on industry, and that whole NATO 3.0 and bringing it to life, I think all of those things were wrapped in with both the industry part of the summit, which is day one, and then the political part, which is day two. So all in all, I think everyone will walk away with a slight sense of relief, and actually a belief that we are making progress, we are moving forward, and we're better off than we were, but much more to do.
Well, Charles, if we look back at the previous summits, back in 2023, for example, in Vilnius, all the focus was on regional defense plans in the aftermath of Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. Then also in Washington in 2024, there was a strong focus on drone and drone warfare. And then in 2025, we saw that commitment of spending 5% on defense across the alliance. How would you summarize what we've just seen in Turkey?
I mean, it wasn't a very ambitious, the aims were not that ambitious, I think. I mean, compared to kind of previous very maximalist summits where, they talk about, shared commitment to democratic values and Euro-Atlantic integration and, China, that was completely absent. I mean, it's very, very focused on the Russia threat, on Ukraine. You can tell that from the communique. It was a very short communique. It was very compact in its goals, and it talked about production. It talked about financing. It was a very kind of practical focus, and it compared to kind of previously very kind of almost ideological bent in previous summits. So I think, frankly, it could have gone a lot worse. I mean, I think there were a lot of people who were predicting that it might fail, that they might fail to agree on language about Russia. They might fail to agree on language about Ukraine. That seems to have come, and Trump's meeting with Zelensky went very well, and I think that was the singular kind of achievement of the summit. That it came off looking very positively, even if the ambitions for NATO seem to have shrunk and a bit compared to the past.
Is there a sense in which Trump needs wins? I mean, look, the Middle East situation is not, the end state is not as previously described, and there's a lot else going wrong for Trump domestically. I got a sense that he just was relieved that because remember, he was kicking NATO hard during the first part of the Strait of Hormuz crisis. Did you get a sense, either of you, and indeed Emma, that it's just a sense of relief there on the other side in Washington as well?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think they were looking to divert focus from what's going on in Iran, and they're, as you say, they're looking for a win. They're looking for backing a winner, and Ukraine suddenly looks like a winner, and so I think that's where all the positive mood music between Trump and Zelensky came from.
Emma, in addition to your work for the NIAG delegation, you are Senior Defence Policy Advisor at ADS. What's your take on, I'm thinking particularly from the industry point of view, and the industry day at the summit?
I think it's a really strong element that's been added to these summits in the past few years. And I think we can see the real focus on industry and the need to include industry more closely is really important for all of these things. I think that there's still a little bit more that can be done to integrate industry more closely. And I think that we need to now swap a little bit more from the focus. There was a huge focus at the industry day on the big announceables, which are really important as a way of showing progress. But we can't just have announceables as headlines. We need proper delivery against the strategic ambition. And so we need to make sure that we're not using these just as a way of getting sort of soundbite announceables that do a political role, but might not necessarily be doing the depth of delivery that we need to see.
Can I just pick you up on something you said earlier, when you said the summary of the outputs from the summits, and you said Vilnius, it was about the regional plans and the agreement of the regional plans, which of course it was. But I think there's a second element to what came out of Vilnius. And this was agreement that they needed to transform the nature of the relationship with industry. And so Vilnius is where this, in a sense, kicked off. Madrid was too early. It was only by the time we get to Vilnius, they realised the level of risk that sits inside the military plans that are due to flawed assumptions and dependencies on industry. And so that's what came out. The Defence Production Action Plan was the big thing that came out of Vilnius. And that's why Washington was the first time that we added an industry day to it. The fact we're now on the third summit where there's an industry day, and if you look at who was on the stage for the industry day, it was really quite notable. President Zelensky there, Rutte, von der Leyen, they were all there. All the military chiefs were on the stage. So I think that might be one of the things that you actually, if you look at it now, you say, well, the industry part of this conversation is now one of the more significant elements where perhaps previously it wasn't.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with you. I, in fact, attended that particular summit back in 2023, and I remember instead of having that defense industry forum, I think it was called something along the lines NATO Public Affairs Forum or something like that. So you're absolutely right, and it's certainly a big win and a big achievement. But maybe building on that, I think one of the other important elements of the summit was Mark Rutte's announcement of that demand signal, unclassified demand signal. We hear often from industry and also World Trade Associations as well, Emma, that industry needs that clear demand signal. Now, can we say that you have now received that clear demand signal, or is it not yet clear enough?
It's the first step, and I think the demand signal and also the NATO front door is a really strong attempt by NATO to kind of provide a coherent market signal to industry and to ensure that there is sufficient visibility of future demand. But we do already know this. We have the DPAP that shows these areas that we need to be getting after. And demand signals from NATO, while they can provide understanding of what NATO needs, it's not the same as a commitment to procurement, because that sits within nations. And so while it is important, there is then a job to do to go back to nations to ensure the delivery against those, and that translates into actual procurement.
I mean, it's a step forward. I mean, what NATO used the summit as an opportunity to do was to agree a new strategy for industry-NATO cooperation. Hasn't attracted too much of the headlines given everything else that's going on, but I think the strategy in there, again, the words are good, but the delivery is the thing that, and it's one of those things about the nature of summits, is you need to announce things. And what is it that you announce? We look for the new initiative, the new announceable, and we don't go back and say, well, have we delivered? And so this is the say-do gap that we're all talking about. There is a huge say-do gap. And so whilst this is welcome, and the front door and all of these are good says, we wait to see the do.
And Emma, as you say, procurement decisions are largely national, but of course we have got the NATO Support and Procurement Agency. It's by our reckoning here at Council on Geostrategy, it is beginning to fade a little bit compared to the momentum that exists behind the European SAFE mechanism. European SAFE money is now dictating national defence industrial plans in a way that NATO can't. And I suppose the point of light is the Saab, the replacement for the AWACS contract, which is not all NATO nations. And I'm wondering how do you situate this? What Sir Stuart's just described, a sort of the say-do gap and the stasis in terms of actual demand, with the emergence of another demand signal, very important one within NATO, which is the EU.
I think that they've got to be seen as complementary. NATO sets the capability requirements and the capability targets. The nations agree to those capability targets, and then any mechanism that helps to deliver on those capability targets has got to be seen as a good thing, as long as we're not duplicating work across nations and across efforts. And so I think that you can see the EU has in recent years really been stepping up in terms of its sort of defence positioning and its policy and the momentum that it's putting behind. And part of that is in delivery to NATO. One of the common themes that we're seeing is around the need for Europe to step up and deliver more for its own security and to do more equitable burden sharing with the US. And so it has a role in delivering that. And I don't think that there's too much concern about it not being matched to NATO capability targets and requirements. I think that ultimately the nations know that is what they need to be delivering against. And it's just different mechanisms for getting after the same end goal.
So can I just pick up? Did you say NSPA fading away?
I meant relative to the way that European SAFE has begun to exert itself into national procurement priorities. We've been trying to do a study of that here at Council on Geostrategy, which is so far unpublished, but we're looking at the nations that really use NSPA for capability are clustered around Germany and the Netherlands, whereas ourselves and France do use it for example, logistics, supply, etc. I'd be interested in your view of where we are with it.
Well, I think, as we look at the 3.5 plus the 1.5% and acquisition pipelines of nations, there is a challenge and an issue there. We know that. Acquisition processes, but there's acquisition capacity as well. And I think what that means is the NSPA is going to have an increasingly important role as part of acquisition. And if you look at their order book and you go back 2 to 3 years, 3.5 to 4 billion euros. If you look at the projected amount going through their books at the end of the decade, and you're up at 30 billion. I think that's a reflection that actually this co-design, co-develop, the acquisition, nations coming together extends beyond Germany and Dutch, and therefore it plays a really important role in that sort of delivery, that sort of sense of here's the money we're spending, this is the capability that we need. Well, how do we go from one to t'other? So it was just the comment about fading away, whereas actually I see it as a critical and growing part of the whole acquisition process.
The problem is you have a number of conflicting goals for defense spending, and all of these governments, every NATO government wants to use its defense spending to grow its economy. So that means spending it at home. And then, but you also have the need for standardization. You don't want 37 different tanks in NATO. You know, that's just completely inefficient. You need one tank, one platform. How do you production share, work share these capabilities, but also you have to get this, then you also have the threat, which is, in a couple of years or something. And so how do you agree this all overnight in a timely manner? And it seems like it's just, I mean, I'm not a specialist on all of these different initiatives and stuff, but I mean, I keep seeing initiatives and announcements and big dollar figures like we saw in NATO, and being aware of the actual amounts that governments have available to spend. I'm thinking this is not going to really work.
It's a central part of NATO 3.0. If Europe and Canada are to play a much more significant role, they've got to do that together. And what is the vehicle for doing that? The high visibility projects that there are, those were not at 32, but subsets of nations getting together. I would say it's something the UK, we've got a good track record. If you look at some of our programs, Eurofighter, that is European combat air. Now, not perfect, but the ability as nations together to co-design, co-develop, co-produce, co-support, cooperate equipment is going to be absolutely a central part of going forward. As you say, we've got to be able to do this together. Better, faster together is the Rutter mantra, and he's absolutely right. But the economic dimension, and this is, I think, where the NATO 3.0 is really interesting, because it's Europe and Canada that are really stepping up. There's a lot more money to be spent. So the nations of those countries will expect there to be a prosperity dimension to this, an economic dimension, jobs and all of that. So there is an element of, who plays into that? And then the US industry, what does it mean for US industry? What does it mean for the UK, Turkey, when you think of EU and the Draghi report that's saying, 80% of our acquisition budget is spent outside the EU. We're going to flip that. What does that mean in terms of industries and collaborations within industries?
The politics of this is very, very difficult. And the problem is solving the politics takes time, and you need to kind of move ahead on some of these. I mean, I was curious to see the $50 billion dollars for the deep precision strike, which the UK is leading. I gather the UK's part of this is the successor to Storm Shadow, which I think they've put the money that's identified in the DIP, but I'm not quite sure how you get to $50 billion across. I mean, there are a lot of countries and stuff, but that seemed a little bit unrealistic, and it seemed like was it just going to be countries kind of throwing in stuff that they were already doing?
The critical thing is that it is clearly addressing a need that has been identified. And I think that that's a really good example of sort of co-production and collaboration of allies getting together and working out where the strengths are within different nations and how we can play those best together.
And I think the politics, though, of this and Trinity House, as one looks at Europe, one looks at Germany, their conventional defence spend is going to be 3 times our conventional defence spend by the end of the decade. That is a power that's there. And therefore, Trinity House in cooperating with Germany, and what might that be? What are the areas? I think that's the politics of this makes it really interesting, because actually you can translate the ambition of Trinity House into a capability which is absolutely needed. When we talk about capability, there's two elements to this. One is your ability to defend yourself, and the second one is your ability to punish the bad guy. You need both. And so all the talks about, you know, integrated air missile defence, I think from a capability perspective, this focus on deep precision strike is long overdue to get that right balance in terms of what you need as your force structure.
Yeah.
So Stuart, so you also led the UK delegation in Portsmouth for the NATO Industrial Advisory Group, I believe for the first time in this century in this country. Could you please walk us through what were the main agreements or priority areas for the UK and also for the Alliance, and how was it translated into what we've just witnessed in Ankara?
Yeah, I think it was brilliant timing. The point of it was this was an opportunity for industry to come together as the NATO Industrial Advisory Group and to debate and discuss our views as industry, you know, big and small, traditional, non-traditional, and fusing all the different perspectives to try and see where there's consensus and where there is conflict. So Portsmouth, as you say, first time this century that we've done it, I think there were probably three elements to it. One was, this was the opportunity to showcase what we are doing in the UK, what our industries are doing, the big, the small, the traditional, the non-traditional. And so one of the days was precisely that. And as part of that, it wasn't just about partnering within industry, it was about partnering with the armed forces. We said about it, ready and resilient together. And the reason for that was we didn't actually want to use it as a shop window. This wasn't us selling stuff. This was us showcasing how we are working together. And the together talks to that partnership. But it also talks about interoperability and what are the interoperability challenges and what are the potential solutions. It's about innovation. And of course, innovation is one of those words that gets thrown around all around because it is so important, it's so critical. And what we were able to do was to demonstrate the innovation, particularly, you know, within industry, and that kind of combination of the SME community and, you know, the more traditional players.
Emma, you acted as the facilitator at this NIAC engagement. Could you please walk us through what you've witnessed?
I think Stuart has said it was a really, really good moment for the UK to showcase this. We saw 32 nations all coming together to be part of the 3 days. We've had senior military, we had senior NATO, we had senior UK government, we had ministerial support, we had a really wide range of industry from primes down to SMEs. We also had a really good support from NATO partners as well. So Japan sent a really large group and joined in, and they were really forward-leaning into this. And I think that's really important. We also had Australia as well, and so it was wider than just the NATO 32, and it was talking about, as Stuart said, that together and partnership and how we can build those partnerships both at national levels, but also at NATO levels, industrially, with governments, with armed forces, and with broader partners as well. So I think it was a really good opportunity to showcase that and then facilitate the discussion as to how we use those partnerships to deliver on the Defence Production Action Plan, to deliver on strategic priorities for NATO, and to build that industrial capability and resilience in support of NATO and in support of Ukraine.
I don't want to overplay it, but actually the NATO First and how NATO First has galvanised, I think, the defence community should not be understated. When we did the Washington Summit, which was straight after the election of this government, this is when we went from Think NATO to NATO First. That has had a galvanising effect. And as we went to Ankara, I think you saw that sense of team. You know, we had Rupert Pearce, the National Arms Director. We had Dan Jarvis there. You know, this is from a defence perspective, you know, leading the way. And industry was there. Charles Woodburn, CEO of BAE Systems. You know, we were there, you know, as one. We have different views, but that NATO First and how it's kind of galvanised the community, I think that's a positive thing, not just for the UK. I think it is for NATO and European NATO. I think therein lies one of the areas where there's potential for the future, for the UK to take that leadership ambition and turn it into something.
It's interesting that, isn't it, Charles? I think it's clear that earlier in the decade, NATO First was not necessarily the previous government's number one signal it was sending to the world.
Right.
I mean, Boris Johnson's Global Britain speech made on the eve of COVID, where he envisaged us basically playing an independent, powerful role in the Pacific. Certainly, as part of the team that works on Labour's policy in opposition, I remember us being very keen to make that. How would you think that is playing post-Turkey, post-Ankara summit?
Britain needs to restructure its military in line with the current threat, and that's what NATO First means to me, and I think to the people I've asked, what does NATO First mean? That it's about Europe, it's about Russia, it's about the High North, it's about the North Atlantic. It's for 20 years, Britain had an expeditionary military that went all over the world, that sailed aircraft carriers through the Straits of through the Taiwan Straits, and and I think the ambitions for NATO have shrunk a bit. There's no longer this, it used to be that in order to be NATO First, you had to go to the Pacific because the U.S. wanted a Pacific presence. Germany sent warships into the Pacific. Now NATO First means take care of Europe, leave the Pacific to the U.S. and don't get involved. That seems to be the message from the Pentagon. So yeah, I mean that's really what is coming through loud and clear to me on that.
As you look at the journey that takes us from the NATO Summit in Wales in September 2014. What we had, remember we had a coalition government and they thought the big decisions had been made in 2010. And that 2015, post that into the next one, it was just going to be a small on the tiller a little bit. But actually, as we saw what happened in 2014, that led to a defence and security review that was probably the most ambitious in terms of what it was trying to do, war fighting at scale against a peer adversary and an Article 5 scenario. This wasn't Iraq, this wasn't Afghanistan, this was something completely different. But then what happened post-2015? Did events get in the way? And well, it's not really that much of a problem. And then we have pivots and tilts or whatever to the Pacific and the economic dimension, which one can understand. But 24th of February 2022 perhaps showed us the error of our ways. We didn't make it stick. What it was we did. Whilst we set an ambition, we did not follow through with a plan to deliver against the ambition. What we can't do is to miss this opportunity.
And I'm wondering, for the three of you, what are the low-hanging fruit opportunities that do arise for UK defence industry right now, coming out of the Ankara summit? So what two are obvious, because drones, the drones and counter-drone both are chime in with what the SDR and the DIP want. IAMD, there's not a lot of money attached to IAMD in the DIP at the moment. So what else could we be looking at?
Can I put something, and it's not sexy, but it's strategic and it's significant, because everybody goes into the drone warfare and this technology, and of course autonomy AI is transforming the nature of how you deliver force. But I would go back to, we have a thing called the Defence Reduction Action Plan. The last 2 days, what people have said the problems are the very things that the DPAP was designed to deliver. And the DPAP actually came from the UK. It was a UK food for thought paper. So I think there's a real opportunity for the UK to show leadership through the National Armaments Director and to say, okay, we've got this Defence Reduction Action Plan. Is it too ambitious? Is that why we're not delivering at the pace? Or is it's the right ambition, but we've got to identify what the blockers to progress are. It's that sort of old-fashioned thing about, are we delivering? And if not, what are we going to do about it? And the leadership that's required between nations and NATO, I think there is a perfect opportunity for not just an opportunity, it's an imperative for the UK to step forward. We have a very strong defence industry. We have this new NAD group. We have got an outstanding team forward in Brussels, led by Angus Lapsley. There's a number of points there. When you pull that together, then there's a real opportunity for UK to show leadership in Europe and deliver against the ambition that sits within the DPAP?
Well, I think what certainly also is needed, of course, are the resources. And I guess this summit was a good opportunity, again, to revisit what is happening when it comes to all the countries trying to achieve that commitment that they made last year to be spending 5% of GDP on defence. Now, the UK, I think currently is number 14 when it comes to the percentage of GDP we spend on defence. It's not a great place to be if we want to continue to lead within NATO. And we know that, well, Charles, perhaps you will have some views on this. From the US side, there have been some comments made that the UK might be losing certain positions within the alliance if we don't step up. The question is, how do we actually overcome this hurdle and do step up and in a timely manner?
I mean, the level of spending is really critical. And that's come through loud and clear. And I think the military and the retired military people that I speak to, because I don't generally talk to the uniformed military, are very disappointed about the level of spending. I think to demonstrate seriousness as the rest of Europe increases defense spending, the UK has to kind of maintain a leadership position in the amount that it spends. One of the problems, I mean, one of the things that the UK has that most other countries don't have is a nuclear deterrent. It's a very expensive nuclear deterrent. It's 20% of the defense budget. They spend more as a percentage of their defense budget than any other. Well, we don't know how much China or Russia spends, but it's an incredibly expensive nuclear deterrent. It crowds out a lot of conventional spending. But that does give the UK, seniority in talking about NATO's, positioning and things like that. So it's very important that the UK has this. That definitely gives the UK this sort of superpower or great power status. But presumably that's not really going to be used in a conflict. That's just in the background, and what you need is these kind of conventional capabilities that are really going to deter Russia, and how you get those without spending, without making a wholesale change in how much you spend on, social spending, how much, how you just restructuring government finances to reflect the new era. I don't quite know how the UK gets there.
So, Stuart, were those conversations taking place during the plenary sessions in Portsmouth?
Yes. I mean, maybe there's two parts to this. And I know, our government would say, if you look at it in cash terms, we're number 3, and so it's still a load of cash, and as you say, the nuclear capability. But I think one element of Portsmouth, but also what we saw in Ankara, was the finance sector and the role of the finance sector in this discussion. I don't think I've seen in the previous summits, and you will know better, but the finance sector played really strongly into the debate. Yes, there was the Defence Security Resilience Bank debate and all of that, but as a key part of the whole defence ecosystem, the source of investment and where we nationally go, and then what other nations are thinking. I think that's a new development, and so I think, to my mind, there's that part of it. I think the second part of it, the mantra, which is, okay, we all hung up, and understandably so, percentage of GDP, but how well spent is it? What capability do you get for that? And I think one of the things I noted, and actually I was listening to Emma earlier, and she was using the language as well, is the language of capability targets is now mainstream. And what that means is your prioritization and your investments are set by the capability targets that you've agreed as part of the NATO defence planning process. And I find that really quite telling. So the finance sector being part of this, the fact that we're using the NATO defence planning process, I think is really interesting. And I think just the third part of that from a national perspective, again, you as commentators will know better than I, but have you ever heard a Prime Minister say, we're going to go into the next spending review and defence is going to be the #1 priority? Have you ever heard that before? I haven't.
I mean, the spending review is going to be crucial because all those within the government and the Labour Party who want to see the 3.5 commitment actually budgeted for are hoping that they will win the argument there. It is a fact that when John Healey resigned, the Treasury was offering 3% in 2034-5. And that was the actual trigger. It wasn't the dip at all.
Yeah.
So there is a clear mismatch between HMG's stated position on the world stage and the HM Treasury's stated position. That's clearly got to be sorted. I'm wondering about, well, let's bring you in, Emma, about ADS. Just any other observations from your members immediately off the back of Ankara?
I think we've covered a lot of it. I think it is all positive signs. I would pick up Stuart's point around the financing mechanisms and the funding side. I think that's been a really important discussion of seeing defence financing as a critical part of delivery as well, and the need to be able to get behind that. I think particularly on the sort of announcements of the Defence and Security Resilience Bank and I think while they're really important, they're not quite the same as sort of solving demand signal problems. And so they can help with the financing, but they don't guarantee orders. They can show political commitment to try and ensure finance is backed behind them, but it's not quite the same thing as linking it to procurement. I think, interestingly, the multilateral defence mechanism does try to look to integrate joint procurement into the model. And so it starts to look at that demand signal problem as well as the financing and connecting the two. And so I think it will be interesting to see how that discussion progresses about the potential complementarity of the multilateral defence mechanism and the DSRB. I think ultimately all of these things are good things. None of them are a particular sort of silver bullet. And the main thing is the contracts. And so I think there is a little bit of, we've heard a lot of this before at previous summits, and there's a lot of very good intentions being stated, but ultimately it does come down to the contracts being placed and to nations getting on and spending the money on it. I think that now that we've got a defence investment plan, we should hopefully see a bit more progress made on that on the UK side in sort of getting on and placing those contracts. But as mentioned, it was disappointing not to see the pathway to laid out for 3% only in the next Parliament, and to see nothing on the 3.5%. And so there's still quite a lot of work that needs to be done in order to realise the good political rhetoric that's being said.
Paul, in the studio, we talk quite often about the need to rely on the whole of society approach when it comes to communicating clearly why defence matters and why we need to spend more on defence. Now, also, Charles, I believe we had a brief exchange before the recording about the communique and how short it actually was this time around. Do you think it's a positive thing or a negative thing that these communiques are getting shorter and shorter each year? And what does it say about how NATO communicates to the external world, what it agrees on?
Yeah, I mean, communication with society is really important, and you have. I mean, speaking of the whole of society approach, you have Finland, the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, Poland are all very much invested in this kind of whole of society approach, where they have civil defense drills and building bunkers and things like that. And the UK, you have statements that are very alarming from the Prime Minister, like, Russia might attack NATO in 2030, but not a kind of, nothing to kind of coming after that saying, well, we have to do this, and we are, basically on the verge of war, because that's very alarming to voters and politically something that you don't do if you're trying to win an election. As far as NATO and the way NATO communicates, I mean, I think it's probably a positive thing that that the first chunk of the communique was about Article 5. It was a statement of unity, and that was what needed to be said, because there was a lot of questions about that, and people, countries, governments are very insecure about that. So the fact that was front and center is very important, and the goals are very concrete, and they focus on defense and production and things like that. But how countries, you need to get to the whole of society approach, you need to be able to communicate the threat. And I think that a lot of countries aren't actually doing that. And I think the countries that are on the front line do that because the society agrees. There is a consensus that there is a threat and that they need to be a part of the response. They need to be ready. And I'm not sure that, the countries that are, if you're kind of in the third or fourth row back from Russia, that these countries are seized of the matter in the way that they should be. Yeah, it's a very, very complicated issue, and but it comes back to electoral politics, I think.
I do think the national conversation, as was coined by this government, that was, as part of SDR, we have got to go to our society and to be clear and compelling in terms of the threat that we face. And I don't think that's necessarily happened in the way that we would have hoped. And we know that we have more to do. During the summit in the industry forum, there was a section of this which was about whole of society approach. We had the Finns on the stage and what it is that they're doing. And then you map against that, I guess, the realpolitik of it when you're in, distant from the threat. But it's a little bit like the debate in Ireland at the moment. Ireland's a very interesting space. It spends 0.2% of its GDP on defence. And yet, one might say, well, the front line is thousands of miles away. Well, no, it's not. It's 12 miles away. Your fibre optic cables that come in, which are, deliver the lifeblood of your high-tech companies, your economic prosperity is at risk. Unless you do something about that. And how we bring this to life, how we make this real for society is absolutely, one of the things. And it attracted its own pillar in SDR. So it was recognised, it is recognised, what we need to do is to go after that. And it isn't just about politicians. This podcast is an important part of this. This is part of the debate, the discussion. I think we all have a role to play in not just talking about the darkness of the future and the threats that we face, but actually what we collectively can do. Defence readiness bill, right? What do we need to be in there? What does resilience mean? What does national versus NATO mean? Article 3 versus Article 5. These are all things that we need to be debating, discussing as part of this conversation.
So the plenary session took place in Portsmouth. The summit took place in Ankara. What's the homework now for everyone? Emma, you represent the Trade Association. What's your key takeaway and what is next for you?
I think the key takeaway needs to be to get on and deliver and to have accountability against delivering on the things that have been agreed. I think that there is this risk, as Stuart mentioned earlier, of at the next summit hunting for the next announceables and sort of forgetting what it was that we've already agreed to. And we need to have a little bit more stringent accountability about measuring the delivery against it and getting on with those things. And I think that needs to be taken back into the nations as well, of saying we've just got to do a little bit of heads down, concerted efforts to deliver some of this, to place some contracts and to do the work.
I think if you reflect on our own DIP and what were the priorities of our DIP there, it was about transforming the armed forces, the technologies that are out there. We mentioned AI, autonomy, and how that is transforming. How do we continue that? I think the second thing, which is backing British business, security and prosperity are two sides of the same national interest coin. And so how do we to do both? We're well positioned. We have a strong defence industry in the UK. How do we exploit that for national and NATO benefit? But it's the third one from the DIP that I would highlight, and that's about leadership and the opportunity for the UK to lead, to stand forward. I think it's there. We sit well when you talk about the transatlantic without going over cliches, but we are well positioned there. So from an industrial, from a political position, we are well set to take a greater leadership role and to do, as Emma says, let's deliver against what it is that we've said. Let's close the say-do gap.
Charles?
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I'm sort of minimalist on this, but I mean, I was sitting through the Treasury, the House of Commons Treasury Committee hearings yesterday, where, you know, a minister from the Defense Ministry and a minister from the Finance Ministry were both kind of pummeled with questions for hours about when are we going to get to 3.0% of GDP? When are we going to get to 3.5% of GDP? 3 hours later, I'm none the wiser. It's very, you know, it's those kind of steps, being clear about when you're going to meet these targets. I mean, the targets are, you know, they're international commitments. They're not unreasonable. And they would secure, you know, if you're Britain and you want to play a leadership role in NATO, you have to meet them. And so just starting there is what I would do. You know.
So Stuart, Charles and Emma, thank you so much for joining us. And Paul, another timely conversation recorded.
Another one checked off the list.
Indeed, and we look forward to seeing you all joining us again for the next episode. And until then,
goodbye.